If you're a parent, teacher, or school leader, and you're sick and tired of the frustration, anger, and unfair treatment of children at high risk in our public schools, then perhaps it's time for all of us to do something about it. In this podcast, Dr. Amitra Berry brings you tips, tools, strategies, and tactics to build successful solutions while touching, moving, and inspiring all of us to transform our schools so that every child thrives. Here's your host, Dr. Berry.
Freedom is never granted. It is won. Justice is never given. It is exacted. Those words penned by A. Philip Randolph. Welcome back, Equity Warriors, and thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of the 3E Podcast. Shout out to our new subscribers. Again, folks, thank you. Your support fuels this movement for educational equity. And if you're not yet a member, visit patreon.com/3E podcast and join us today. It's story time. So gather round, turn off all the extra noise, and listen up. This story is called The Brave Journey of the Pearl. Once upon a time in a city called Washington, D.C., many people lived in a world that was unfair. Some were free, but others were enslaved, forced to work without pay, and kept away from their families. They dreamed of freedom, of a life where they could choose their own path and be with the people they loved. One night, under a sky full of twinkling stars, 77 brave men, women, and children quietly made their way to the river. They had a secret plan. A big wooden ship called the Pearl was waiting for them, ready to carry them to freedom. Their hearts beat fast as they climbed aboard. The ship's captain, Daniel Drayton, and his crew, they were kind men who wanted to help. They raised the sails and the Pearl began to glide down the Potomac River, heading towards safety. The people huddled together, whispering prayers and dreams of a new life. But the wind had other plans. It stopped blowing and the ship couldn't move fast enough. Meanwhile, someone had told the slave catchers about the escape, and a group of angry men gathered their fastest boats and chased after the Pearl. Before the Pearl could reach freedom, the pursuers caught up. The enslaved people were taken back to Washington, D.C., where they were punished. Many were separated from their families and sold far away. It was a heartbreaking day. Even though the escape was stopped, their story did not end there. News of the Pearl spread across the country, and more people joined the fight to end slavery. People like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman were inspired to work even harder to help others escape. Many years later, slavery was finally abolished, and the dream that the Pearl's passengers had that night came true for many others. Their journey, though filled with hardship, became a story of bravery, hope, and the unstoppable fight for freedom. And so the spirit of the Pearl sailed on, not in the water, but in the hearts of those who never stopped believing in justice. The scene was Washington, D.C. in 1848. In 1862, D.C. was a paradox. It was the epicenter of American democracy where the ideals of freedom were proclaimed, but still more than 3,000 enslaved people lived in bondage. There was this big national debate about slavery's morality, but the economics that were fueling the country and creating wealth for white people. D.C. was a microcosm of that conflict. Think about this. This contradiction in the nation's capital, a city that was supposed to symbolize liberty and justice, but at the same time, holding people in bondage. When I think about that, I think about the words in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Which men? And at that point in time, only men. not women. And unless you were a white man with land, you really were not guaranteed those unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And you certainly were not supposed to get them if you looked like me. So the Pearl, 1848, to get my years right, 1848, that story, I wanted to make it like a children's story because that way we can tell it to children. It was the largest recorded escape attempt by Black people enslaved in America. But how many of you have heard that story before? Not very many of us. Yes, that plan was thwarted by bad weather and they were captured and returned to bondage. But the incident of the Pearl sparked more debate about slavery. And it really highlighted the courage and the desperation for freedom that Black people had. That same desperation lives today. So in 1862, Abraham Lincoln signed the District of Columbia Compensated Emancipation Act. Compensated Emancipation Act. Now, don't get excited because compensation was not for those who were enslaved. The compensation went to the slave owners. They were paid up to $300 per individual slave that they freed, but nothing to the person who had been removed from their home, sold off to a distant land or to a distant family, separated from people that they know and love, held in bondage. Nope, you're free. You got nothing. No land, no money, but you're out there. So 1862, $300, what does that get you? Because I don't want anyone to think, well, that's not a whole lot of money. $300 in DC in 1862 would get you several acres of land. In current dollar value, that land would be between $2.9 and $14 million per acre. That's the cost. That was the price, the value of a Black human being. In 1862, $300 would get you a small house in DC. Today, at minimum, you need between $650,000 and $720,000 for that same small home, but their same small home now would at least have running water. A little bit of a disparity there. When we talk about systemic inequity, this is what we're talking about. The government paid the slave owners. They compensated them. It allowed them to buy more land. It allowed them to build more houses, but it gave nothing to my ancestors. Inequities that persist today. That is the basis for the racial wealth gap and limited access to opportunities that followed. Today, in 2025, there's still a struggle for equity. Systemic oppression continues to manifest in the disparities we see across education, housing, healthcare, and criminal justice. But my focus, as always, is on education. And just as I read that story, thank you, ChatGPT, for turning the history into a children's story. I didn't do that creative writing on my own. We are living at a time in America where we cannot or we're not supposed to tell those stories, where the federal government, where the occupant, the Mango Mussolini that's living or occupying the White House, he and his little sidekick, the unelected Doge King, are trying to remove that history, trying to shut down places like the African American Museum of History. I always get my numbers wrong. The Black Museum, the Black Smithsonian in DC. They don't want those stories told. They don't want you to know that that's how some of their ancestors, at least the ones that were here in the 1800s, because many of the people in power, their ancestors weren't here. They came over during one of the great waves, but mine were here. We've been here since the late 1600s. I want you to think about how far we've come, but how much further we need to go, and why these stories are important if we're ever going to dismantle inequity and educate our children, truly educate our children about the history of this country and why we see the inequities that we do. So, the Compensated Emancipation Act, a little bit of background, April 16th, 1862, for those of you who like dates. Abraham Lincoln signed that act, and it was the first time that the federal government officially freed enslaved people. Now, this is not the big Emancipation Proclamation that you're thinking about. This was just in D.C., and it liberated about 3,100 Black slaves in D.C. And just in case you didn't know, enslaved people built D.C. The city was entrenched in slavery, in spite of the fact that it was the capital. So slaveholders get their compensation, free individuals get nothing. So even in moments of progress, there is inequity. Now, we have always had allies, and were it not for allies, that never would have happened. The abolitionists of the time, people like Senator Henry Wilson of Massachusetts. Senator Wilson championed emancipation in D.C. because he said that doing that would be a model for national efforts for abolition. At the same time, Black folk were fighting for freedom in their own ways. Acts of defiance, escape attempts like the Pearl, collaboration with abolitionists. They would pretend to be sick, work slowly, do some shoddy work, break a tool here or there. Now, it was hard for enslavers to prove that the slaves were not doing what they were supposed to do, but it was enough to disrupt the efficiency of forced labor. Another thing they did, theft. Hate to say it, but theft. Stealing things like food so that they could eat, right? What they did was provide resources and at the same time reject the system that was exploiting them. But then there was more active resistance, more visible things like arson, sabotaging crops, fighting with the overseers, and, pardon my French, just escaping or getting the fuck out. But that was not easy either. Those are things that carried a lot of risk, but still demonstrated the determination of people to assert their autonomy. There are broad implications to that act and a lot of lingering inequities. That act was a significant step forward, at the same time, deeply flawed. There was a fund of $100,000 that was included as part of the legislation to encourage freed Black people, get this, not to compensate them and help them get established, but to encourage them to go to Haiti or Liberia. So giving freedom at the same time underscored by racist ideology that says you have no place here unless you are to chattel for us to create wealth. I just can't. Removing people instead of integrating them as equals. Oh my goodness. Are we not seeing that right now? Is that not reflected in the current policies of the day? Systemic inequities embedded in that legislation, not much different from what we're seeing now. Wealth inequality, educational disparities, systemic racism in housing, healthcare, people who have immigrated to this country for a better life for their children attending school so that perhaps they'll be the first person in their family to ever be educated, to ever go to college, being removed from colleges, from classrooms, and sent to countries that they have no connection to because of their ideas and the color of their skin. I don't know that there is an easy answer. We still have educational segregation today. There's a lot going on. And I brought this up today because Juneteenth is coming. Now, Emancipation Day is April 16th. So I wanted this to air so that we have another marker in the calendar that we may not have known about before. But Juneteenth is coming in June. And so this is a time to start educating yourself and others in the community. You can have an event or a discussion about Emancipation Day and tie that onto the upcoming Juneteenth. Raise awareness and deepen the understanding of the historical significance of Emancipation Day. Get a hold of some anti-racist reading, racial equity guides, some learning materials. If you need help with that, reach out to me. I can point you in the right direction. Advocate. Number 2, advocate for reparations. Now, California is probably further along than anywhere else, but there are several local initiatives that are addressing historical inequities through reparations or reparative policies, scholarships for marginalized communities. And this isn't just Black people, but Indigenous Americans as well, housing programs that are aimed at closing the wealth gap. Again, by the time you hear this episode, which will be in April 16th, it'll be too late to incorporate that in the classroom activities. And most of you won't be in school come Juneteenth. So here's the challenge, educators, classroom teachers, school administrators. Make this an inspiration, a springboard for Juneteenth. Use that time that you are probably sitting in right now. Spring testing is over. And we know what happens, even though we, to the contrary, will say, oh no, we teach right up until the last day of school. Yeah, but we know after spring testing is over, when that testing window closes, so does a lot of other stuff. So think about it. When you start to ease up on the heavy stuff because testing's over, use this for some project-based learning activities centered on events like Juneteenth that occur when school's out of session. Share those projects with me on Blue Sky. I am at Almitra Berry, as I am everywhere, but Blue Sky is where I prefer to be. If you're not on that platform, join it, follow me. It is a wonderful community of educators that have conversations that are good and healthy and focused on children. So get on Juneteenth. Get on Blue Sky, and then join me again next episode. Of course, if you've got a question, a topic you want covered, a special request, text it to me. Look down in the notes below for that link. I want to hear your stories. And remember, don't worry about the things you cannot change. Change the things you can no longer accept. And that's a wrap for today's episode of the 3E Podcast. Now, here's how you can make a real difference. First, smash that subscribe button. It's free. It's easy. Just do it. Second, share the show with anyone you know who cares about education. And third, consider becoming a supporter of the show. Together, we're not just talking about change, we're making it happen. Make a donation today to be part of that mission and change, and I'll catch you next time.